Good morning / afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Lena Brooke, and I'm the Food Campaigns Director with an environmental organization called the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. And I'm excited to be here today with Dr. Lance Price, who is the founding director of George Washington University's Antibiotic Resistance Action Center. Today, which is November 18th, kicks off World Health Organization's Antibiotic Awareness Week. And we're really grateful that our friends at Nyman Ranch invited us to take over their Facebook account and talk to all of you about antibiotic use on farms and how each of us has the power to fight antibiotic resistant superbugs. So I think we'll start by having Lance explain why the WHO sets aside a whole week every year to increase our awareness about antibiotics. Tell us why this is so important.
Well, it's really considered one of the greatest threats that we face in public health. So, we've had antibiotics in human medicine since about the 1940s, and it was a nearly miraculous introduction to human medicine, because these infections that were killing lots and lots of people before could now be readily treated. So you could give people a pill or a bottle of pills, and or an injection or a couple of injections, and this drug would specifically kill the bacteria and not damage the person, which was just amazing. And over the years, we've discovered lots of different antibiotics, and many of them safe and effective. But as we've used them heavily in both human medicine and in animal production, we've helped fuel the growth of bacteria that are resistant to these medicines. And meanwhile, the drug companies that used to bring these to market have figured out that they just don't make as much money off of these drugs as they do off of other medicines. So they've started to leave this marketplace. So they've started closing down their new drug discovery and leaving us with the continued evolution of drug-resistant bacteria and no real new drugs to meet that challenge. So I would say that's the basic bit. I mean, and now, now we see, just to put some numbers on it, I think, I hate to put big numbers on things because it's really about individual lives shattered, lost, families destroyed. But I mean, we're talking about, tens of thousands of people in the United States and hundreds of thousands of people around the world that are dying each year today of drug-resistant infections. And that number is only supposed to get much worse into the future.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that context. And it is, quite sobering to think about that global impact in the long term. The number that I've seen experts predict is something like 10 million people dying each year by 2050 if we don't really take the antibiotic resistance threat seriously now. And
that's
especially,
estimate, actually.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's a conservative estimate. I mean, the numbers could get much worse, actually.
Right. And, given in the fact that we are right now living in the midst of a public health crisis, we're seeing how painful that is. And we know how high the stakes are. So the hope is that as we're thinking about solutions to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, that we also start preparing and taking seriously the antibiotic resistance threat that is unfolding all around us, and just in a much slower way, in a less visible way right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an interesting thing, because the world is now recognizing, the importance of infectious diseases. And one of the things that we're struggling with is like a new vaccine or medicines or something. We've been asking for 10 months, like, give us something to treat this. And meanwhile, we are destroying the medicines that we need to treat really common infections. And so it's sort of I hope there's a shift in sort of our thinking and start to recognize the value of these medicines and start taking better care of them.
Absolutely. That that reminds me of the concept of antibiotic stewardship, where we're being asked to really, like you said, to take care, to protect this essential toolkit of modern medicine. One of my colleagues is a physician by training at the NRDC, and he often talks about the fact that modern medicine as we know it really can't exist without antibiotics. They are essential to so many medical procedures, in addition to being kind of the first line of defense for bacterial infections, really common infections like strep throat or pneumonia or ear infections in some cases, and something that we sort of continue to take for granted.
Yeah,
So
I would say, I mean, one thing that I hear a lot, and I totally agree with this, is that this is a foundation of modern medicine, right? And if you just think about all of the procedures that are built on having functional antibiotics. Just think about cancer treatment. I mean, we have these really, we're investing, millions and millions of dollars every year in trying to discover new chemotherapies. And each year, lots of people get treated with these new drugs. But when you're being treated with a chemotherapy, you're totally susceptible to these bacterial infections. And so without a functional antibiotic, you could die of what should have been, a $5 prescription while you're being treated with, these very expensive medicines. And I think that's tragic. I watched this with my sister. She had cancer, and the first 3 rounds of chemotherapy, her immune system was knocked back so badly that she got a bacterial infection with each round. And if it hadn't been for the antibiotics, she would have died long before the cancer treatment could have saved her. But she was saved, thankfully.
Yeah. Oh, I'm really glad to hear that, and thankful that the antibiotics worked in her case. Right. That's sort of the miracle of the process. All right, I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction here. Most people, when they think about antibiotics, I'm sure they think about the doctor's office and prescription medicine, in instances when people need those drugs. But what many people may not know is that nearly 2/3 of drugs that are medically important, that are deemed medically important by the Food and Drug Administration, by the World Health Organization, are, in the United States at least, are actually sold for use on food animals, not people. And I think that's part of the reason why a company like Nyman Ranch invited us to have this conversation today. Like, we really, let's talk a little bit more about the connection between how livestock and animals are raised in the United States and this issue of antibiotic resistance.
Well, so the issue with using antibiotics in animals, so we can take it from the way the animals are raised, right? So we raise animals, and most of the animals are raised in these highly industrialized systems. Some people call, they're typically referred to as concentrated animal feeding operations. So you're bringing thousands of animals together in one small place, and then you're trying to somehow keep them healthy until they reach, slaughter weight, right? And those often crowded, unsanitary conditions can lead to diseases. And so rather than change the way we raise them, we give them antibiotics. So the reason that matters is that when you give the animals antibiotics, so think about 100,000 chickens in a house, all crammed together, or thousands of pigs all crammed together. When you give them antibiotics in their feed or in their water, you're going to force the bacteria that live in those animals or on those animals to become resistant to those antibiotics. Now, some of those bacteria have the potential to cause disease in people. And so when you slaughter those animals, you're going to inevitably contaminate some of the meat with those bacteria. And then those meat products then go into the community where they can, people can become exposed to those bacteria. So think about Salmonella or Campylobacter. These are typical foodborne pathogens that have become resistant to the antibiotics that we use in animals, right? So then when we get exposed to those through the food supply, when we bring those contaminated products into our kitchen, and we accidentally contaminate ourselves, ingest those bacteria, and we get infected, if that infection progresses to where it gets into the blood, and that happens sometimes, you really need an antibiotic to work. Well, any antibiotic that we've, use on the farm that we've made those helped those bacteria evolve resistance to are not going to work, right? So you limit the options that the doctor has for treating you.
Got it. Yeah, that's quite sobering to think about. And, especially the fact that the way food animals are raised in this country, as you were describing, in these, either in feedlots or in really kind of intense operations, in the case of pigs or chickens, you're sort of creating a breeding ground for disease. They're highly stressful environments for these animals. And so the risk of infection is high. And yet we have this practice that's really common in many livestock industries of using antibiotics on a routine basis. So not necessarily reserving these drugs for moments when animals are sick, or if there is a disease outbreak that needs to be controlled. Like, those are considered to be responsible antibiotic uses. And we definitely want to be treating sick animals. But unfortunately, the routine use of antibiotics continues day in and day out, and particularly, as I understand, in the beef and pork sectors. We've made a lot of progress in chicken in recent years that we could talk about in a little bit as well.
Yeah, but I think something you said really struck me, which is, that we should treat, if we have sick animals, we should treat them. But what I see is we've engineered systems that make animals sick, and then we use that as a justification for giving them routine antibiotics, which I think is just kind of stupid. Right? Because we know what happens, right? So you engineer a system that makes animals sick, you give them antibiotics, which breeds antibiotic resistant bacteria that can then cause drug resistant bacteria infections in people. That's kind of dumb. And so,
it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, what I've seen that I think is pretty cool is the work that you guys have done and others with, antibiotics off the menu and chain reaction, in terms of helping bring light to this topic. And it's really driven chicken producers off of drugs, right? So, I think prior to 2012, it was less than 4% of producers were raising without antibiotics. Today, it's almost all, right?
Yeah, there's been such a profound shift in antibiotic use practices, and particularly, and again, in this category of drugs that are considered to be medically important, so relevant for human medicine, where there are classes of antibiotics that are similar in both contexts. The antibiotics off the menu, which includes NRDC and groups like US PIRG and Consumer Reports and FACT, Food Animals Concern Trust, and others, have spent a lot of time kind of calling on companies directly to pay attention to consumers. Actually, consumers have been extremely worried about this issue of antibiotic resistance for a long time now, and show a real preference for products that are meat products that are responsibly raised. And thanks in large part to that kind of interest on the part of eaters, and also leadership by major chicken producers in particular, we've seen a radical shift, like you said, where I think, almost all chicken in the US now, like over 90%, is produced without the routine use of medically important antibiotics. And this was certainly not the case 5 years ago. The chain reaction scorecard that you had mentioned, that we've been publishing since 2015, rates actually the top 25 restaurant chains, companies like McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's and Panera and Chipotle, on what their corporate policies looks like when it comes to antibiotic use. And the first year we put out the report, less than a handful got passing grades. There were a couple of leading companies, Chipotle and Panera, and really not a lot of leadership otherwise within that sector. And if you fast forward to 2019, the landscape looks so incredibly different. And we saw like 17 out of 25 companies with strong commitments in place. And most of those had already been implemented. So I take a lot of, pride maybe in being a part of this change. And I'm happy to see that companies are stepping up and doing what they can. And of course, now we need to inspire a similar change on pork and beef, which lags really far behind.
Well, Thanksgiving is coming up, so we shouldn't forget turkey. And
we should not forget turkey.
On a per pound of meat produced, turkey's on the same scale as pork and beef, but because there's so much more pork and beef produced, they use a lot more antibiotics. So I agree, and I think, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I really like about Niman Ranch, and so I don't get any money from Niman, but when I get invitations from them, I usually accept, because they give this model for how to do this, right? And they're serving as a model, showing that it can be done. You can raise these animals without routine antibiotics, and you can be profitable, and you can make a really good product. And so I think this comes back to, thinking about the global challenge of antibiotic resistance, what it means to people's lives, what we now understand about the importance of infectious diseases, and then what we understand about the importance of having medicines that work, and then valuing those and then saying, all right, we have to use these carefully. And carefully does not mean giving animals antibiotics based on a clock or a calendar to prevent diseases that we're causing because of the way we're raising them. They call some of these diseases production diseases, because they're diseases that arise because of the way we produce the animals. And so, I hope that we can shift. And
I hope so too.
I think the other piece that we have to recognize is that we are a model for the rest of the world. So the rest of the world, think about the developing world, where they're rapidly developing, they're making more money, and they're shifting to more of a meat-centric diet, and they're adopting our means of producing these animals, right? So they are now starting to produce these big CAFOs in low and middle income countries, and they're also adopting our use of antibiotics. And so if we don't serve as a good model, as stewards of antibiotics, then we're going to see the evolution of really scary bacteria in these countries, and we've already seen that. And as we've learned, microbes get around, right? So they travel the world with us on products, and once these genies are out of the bottle, we see that it's really hard to put them back in.
Yeah. Yeah, the microbes certainly don't respect any boundaries, whether they're national boundaries or geographic, really. And you're right. I mean, the system is a broken one. We are creating this problem, essentially. And so we have the power to shift away to a much healthier livestock production system. And that has to be part of the solution if we're to get a handle on antibiotic resistance. And the point of having the US be exporting its bad practices to other parts of the world is particularly concerning, because really it should be happening in the reverse. We know there are countries, Australia, New Zealand come to mind. There are others that are raising animals responsibly and still, producing lots of meat and having thriving industries. And frankly, I'd like to see us taking a cue from their playbook instead of exporting our problematic one. I see that there's a question in the chat here, and I just wanted to really honor this. Somebody was asking what labels consumers should look for in grocery stores when buying meat. That's a really good question, and one that I can quickly answer. So first of all, asking questions about antibiotic use practices at your grocery store, at restaurants, at farmers markets, anywhere you're buying meat is a really good practice. It continues to signal to whoever you're talking to that this is important, and we want folks to continue to ask questions and to show that interest. In terms of certifications, I would say that anything that's third-party verified is really important. It could be a USDA certification like organic or certified humane, animal welfare approved, or it can also be a package can say raised without antibiotics on it, and that is another label to look for.
Yeah, I would say, you know, the chicken example that you brought up, I think is a really important one for our friends on Facebook here, because it really shows the power of the consumer, right? Because it was really what I've talked to the people at the companies, and they say it was really consumer demand, right? So consumers started asking about this. When you talk to Purdue, why did you switch? Because when I started graduate school, they were not raising their animals without antibiotics, but today they're, you know, one of the leaders. And when you talk to them, why did you do this? You know, they'll tell you, well, we want to do the right thing. You know, that's but they'll also, if you really talk to them, they'll say, because we were hearing from consumers, right? They put demand on us, and so you have the power to really change this, right? So being vocal in your grocery stores, being vocal in your restaurants, and being vocal online to these big producers of pork, turkey, and beef.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100% that the consumer demand has completely transformed and the industry, I think the chicken industry in particular in recent years. I've spoken to so many restaurants that surveyed their customers just to see what was important to them. And we're really surprised to see that, in fact, antibiotic use in meat was a top issue that emerged from those surveys, and that actually inspired companies to make change on this, you know, in this way. And we want that ball to keep rolling. It's super important for that consumer voice to be heard and respected. And in addition to that, of course, we also need policy change in order to lock in a totally different system in the United States that protects these precious drugs and disallows the routine use that we're so worried about, that's really driving this pattern of antibiotic resistance that is a threat to public health.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen the FDA has made progress over the years, and I you know, I've bashed on them for a long time, but if you really look at it, they have made this slow incremental progress. And the last thing they did in the Obama administration was to get rid of through this voluntary process, got rid of the growth promotion claims. That is allowing producers to give animals antibiotics just to make them grow faster, which was done for more than 70 years, right? This is insane.
Well, that was the reason why antibiotics started being used in livestock in the first place, is that it had this, they don't really understand even the mechanism for why the animals grow faster when they're given antibiotic drugs. But as I understand, that was the main reason why initially
1940
they were used in the industry, right?
Yeah, is almost as early as they were discovered, they were being introduced to animals, right? So we finally closed that door, but there is this big loophole, which is the routine disease prevention, right? So giving animals antibiotics to prevent diseases that we're causing, you know. And so I think that's the loophole that we need to close now, and that's a loophole big enough for 20 million pounds of medically important antibiotics to go through, right? So we're still using a lot of medically important antibiotics in the United States. I will say again that we've made progress in which antibiotics are allowed to be used, but we need to show the world that we value all of these antibiotics and protect them all. I guess the other thing that we can do, besides just being vocal, is to vote with our money and to support the companies that actually have those labels that say raised without antibiotics.
That's right. That's right. Yep. And you know, in terms of policy change, I would say that we also encourage you to engage with your elected officials on this issue. It's really important if we want that loophole that you were talking about in our antibiotics laws to be closed, and if we want the incoming Biden administration to take this issue seriously and to set national reduction targets, for example, for the livestock sector, which do not exist right now, or perhaps even more importantly, actually collect antibiotic use data on farms. This is something that's not happening right now. And we remain fairly in the dark about what's really happening on the ground on farms in the United States. And that lack of transparency is really setting us back on this issue. So if we want policy change, which is ultimately the end goal here, we need to create new rules and regulations that send a clear signal across all livestock industries. Then I do really encourage you to send that message to your legislators. The more they hear from you, the more that they'll understand that this is important. And hopefully that message will get kind of funneled up to the top and make this the issue of addressing antibiotic resistance as a public health threat as important of an issue to address as the COVID-19 crisis that we're living through right now.
Yeah, I would say transparency is obviously very, very important. And what we see when we just look at the bacteria on meat, just among conventional products, right? So those where they could be using antibiotics, is that there's really a wide range of resistance levels. So some products, some brands, there are lots of resistant bacteria, other brands, very few. And it'd be really nice to know, hey, does this correlate with drug use? I would assume so, but until we have the data, we can't say that.
Right. Yeah, and asking producers, we want producers to be using antibiotics as responsibly as possible. And we want to see them, especially because companies are now making commitments to reductions. But if we don't really have a clear understanding of what the baseline looks like, of how much use is happening now, it's hard to get a handle on what a 25% reduction really looks like and whether that's sufficient or whether there's much more room to go. So yeah, the countries that are tracking antibiotic use and that have committed to strong reduction targets, like the Netherlands and Denmark, are worldwide leaders on this issue and have made enormous strides in reducing overall use and reducing overall resistance patterns as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and in Canada, when they stopped injecting chicken eggs, the chicken eggs that go to become broiler chickens that we eat, when they stopped that process, we saw this rapid decrease in drug-resistant salmonella on chicken products. And so it'd be great if we could have those same types of data, those same examples in the United States, where we watch as they turn that volume down on the antibiotics and see whether that relates to decreased drug-resistant bacteria on products and in people, So we need sunlight, right?
We know what needs to happen. The solutions are at our fingertips, and I think consumers are at the heart. Consumer/voters are kind of at the heart of all of this, right? And the more vocal you are, whether it's voting with your wallet, whether it's talking to the butcher at the grocery counter, or whether it's sending an email to your congressperson, all of that really, really matters. Your voice really matters in elevating this issue. Yeah. Well, oh my gosh. Yeah, Lance, all of a sudden we're quickly out of time here. I think we have to wrap. This has been such a great bi-coastal conversation. Thanks for all that you do every day to advance this work. Super important.
And thanks to everybody that tuned in. Go vote with your dollars and your voice, and let's make good positive change.
Excellent. And thank you, Nyman Ranch, for giving us the space to have this conversation.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
And for delicious products.
And that, yeah, exactly.